And so that is his work in the world. And that's, maybe we should be preaching more about those subjects. But the main subject of the New Testament messages, I could read you sermon after sermon, because I've read almost, I think, all of them, sermons that were preached. They focused on the resurrection. I mean, when Paul goes into Athens and he's at Mars, what does he talk about? The resurrection. What does Peter talk about on the day of Pentecost? Resurrection. Resurrection. He's raised from the dead. Paul argues if he's not raised from the dead, we are men most miserable because we follow a foolish idea. We're doing a foolish thing to commit our lives to Christ and to live the kind of lives we live if Jesus is not risen from the dead. But it's worse yet. You're in worse shape. If Jesus isn't risen, you're still in your sins. The resurrection was critical, and yet what? How often do we hear a message on the resurrection of Christ? We don't hear messages on lots of things. But on the resurrection of Christ, we rarely hear it except at Easter time. But that's not the way they taught it. They made the resurrection all about holiness, all about everything. If Jesus is risen, then we have a changed future, a changed life. And so we need to get back to that, maybe. And we find it. We find it throughout the epistles. We see it in Acts 2:32, Acts 17:3, Romans 10:9 and 10 says you must believe that Jesus is raised from the dead to even be converted to Christ, even be a child of God. So the resurrection was what they preached. Then I'm wondering about leadership. As you read this, I have friends of mine that go to churches that have priests. I won't fight with them about that. It's not worth an argument. But there are no priests in the New Testament. Only there are priests, but they're scorned. You read what Jesus said to the priests. He called them snakes in the grass. He called them whited sepulchres. And then we don't have the word priest assigned to anybody, except that all our members, all believers in Christ, are members of a royal priesthood. We're all a kingdom of priests. Every single Christian is a priest. So that word that's not even a word that we should be using. It's because it's not a New Testament. It's not an apostolic word. There are other words that describe what leaders do, and what are their roles. Here's another word, reverend. Really? Reverend? Should we call people reverend? Comes from the word reverent. Really? To be revered? No. In fact, the instruction is to call no man, Jesus said this himself, he said, don't call anybody master or father on the earth, but all you are brothers. There's no hierarchy. There's no hierarchy. We're all equal. We're all brothers and sisters in Christ. There's no hierarchy. And yet we've created, in a way, a hierarchy because many of the new churches are driven and run top down by CEOs. The apostles weren't like that. The apostles weren't driving the church from the top. They were underneath. Jesus wasn't from the top. He was underneath. He said, I didn't come to be served. I came to serve and to give my life a ransom for many. And yet now we have a new model, which is almost run like a corporation with CEOs, high-paid CEOs, and people are under them. People say, I go to so-and-so's church, or I go to so-and-so's church. But is that biblical? I don't think so. But you know something? We don't care what's biblical. That's one of the problems. Now, I think the word pastor is a good word. It's a good word. It's a biblical word. The real word for pastor, the way it translates, is poimen, or a shepherd, one who is a shepherd. The word priest, let's forget about it, but pastor's okay. But I'm going to tell you, folks, the New Testament church wasn't run by one senior pastor. The Christian church in the first century, read through it, it had pastors, plural. And the work of those pastors were equip the people. That's what it was for. They were under them. They were under the people. And the only reason a person was ever a pastor is because of the gifting. The church recognized, there's a person who's gifted they're doing the work of caring for us and leading us and protecting us and doing the sacrificial work of ministering to us. So it was an honor when they began to call you a poimen or a pastor or a shepherd. So the word pastor, the word elder, presbyteros, the word even bishop is a word considered to those who are overseers. But if you run a small group, if you have a small group, you should be a pastor. You will be held accountable for the people that God puts underneath you. We have people, as a friend of mine said, we have people assigned to us. You know, you should ask the question, has God assigned such and such to me? Has God called me to have people assigned to me? Who are those people? Well, in small groups, those people should be not just hosting an evening for coffee and donuts and cookies. And if you're vegan, it would be different, but we wouldn't have any meat or ham or cheese. But, you know, the idea of a small group leader is they don't just have folks into their house on Thursday night, but they're calling these people and caring for these and pastoring these people and looking after them and creating environments for them to grow. That's the work of these people. And they need to know how to do it themselves. You should never have a small group leader who himself isn't discipled. It's small group leaders who should be teaching people how to pray and to give witness and to know the scriptures. That's part of their role. So you have pastors, plural, and then you have the idea of a deacon. Now, some people, they just don't even know where a deacon has come from. Deacons show up in Acts, the 6th chapter. We don't have time to read everything, but Acts chapter 6 is an incredible story. You guys know what it was, if you've read it at all. It's where we get the word deacon. It's where the idea, not the word, but the idea of a deacon comes from. All of this is carefully explained in the pastoral epistles of Timothy and Titus, where it's explained the qualifications of deacons and the qualifications of elders. So you have multiple elders, multiple pastors, presbyteros, and then you have deacons. Well, where did the deacons come from? Well, you know the story. There are now the church has exploded, and the people are coming to know the Lord, and they've got more than they can handle. They've had 3,000 saved in one day, and more will be added to the church. And they have to create even a kind of a welfare system. They have to do this in order to feed people, because the widows, they don't have any way to care for themselves, so they set up food and start feeding people. And guess who's doing this work? The elders, the presbyteros, the apostles. They're out there and they're dishing out food. And then the note comes that, you know what, this isn't fair. Some of the people were complaining. The Hellenistic or Grecian Jews from the diaspora, from the other countries around, they weren't quite treated the same. Maybe there was a little bit of racism here. Yeah, there was a little bit of racism. They came and they said, look, when you're dishing out matzah balls, the Hebrew women are getting more hot matzah balls than we are, the Hellenistic women and widows, and that doesn't seem right to us. And so this became an issue. So they said, look, we need to look around yourselves and see, said to the congregation, choose 7 men. Now, women were also deacons, but choose, in this case, 7 men who are of good report and full of faith, and you can read the qualifications there, and let them attend to this work, because it's not reasonable for us as elders and as apostles. It's not reasonable for us to be engaged in serving at the tables. How can we do both? If we serve at the tables night and day, we can't be helping people, teaching them and maturing them in the faith. So we need some other kinds of helpers. And these weren't unspiritual people. You couldn't get on that deacon role unless the congregation didn't call you out and say, I think that guy would make a good deacon, or that guy, they wouldn't agree on that if you didn't have the qualifications to do that job. If you weren't doing it already, they looked around and they saw people who were doing it. And they said, hey, you know what? That person's a deacon. Now, many churches, they don't even have deacons. They have trustees, and deacons are members of ordained bodies, and you have archdeacons, and you have all these roles, but they're nothing like the New Testament deacons. The New Testament deacons were there to take care of the human needs of people, so that the presbyteros and elders could look after the spiritual needs. Now, look, every church, if you're in a church anywhere and there's more than 10 people or 20 people, you're going to find there are pastors and elders, and there are deacons. There are people who serve. You didn't get just chosen and say, go be on a committee. They would looked around and said, this person, these people are doing this thing. And guess what? So they chose 7. They put out 7 names, and everybody felt good about them, and they chose these 7 names. And when you look at them, you find out they're Hellenistic names. They chose 7 from the Greek background, so that then the Greeks could never say, hey, these guys, all the guys you chose are Hebraic Jews. So they played fair. They wanted to be sure that everything was done properly and in order. So that's what you see here, is you see the deacons rise up. And the word diakonos has a very interesting origin. Like the word poimen, shepherd, the word diakonos comes from the word of under rower. Kind of means under rower. And you all have seen Phoenician ships where you don't see these people, but they're in the bottom of the ship, and they're the ones who are rowing the boat. But yet the boat goes nowhere without these diakonos, these under rowers. So you have those deacons who God has called, just the same as he has called. There's no difference. One's not better than another. They simply have different gifts. God has given different gifts for what? For the purpose of getting the ministry done. So I believe in every church we've got deacons, and if we would possibly just identify them and develop them and recognize them and commission them, and we've got elders. It's not just the people who are ordained, who've been to seminary, who've been to Bible college, who've had hands laid on them, and they've got degrees. And none of the early apostles had degrees. They weren't chosen because they had degrees. They were chosen because they were gifted. You can get all of the theological education in the world and have no gift for ministry. I've seen it. And many churches now, they bring people in from outside. They don't raise up. Well, let's talk about that. How did they find their leaders? Well, we've seen this. They looked around. They recognized them. They didn't go get them. They didn't go pick them out of a seminary and because of their degree. They said, who is it here in this congregation, in this group of people? Who is it who's doing the work of overseeing? Who are these people who God has ordained to do this work? And even the question remains, were people even ordained at all? Ordained, like I'm ordained. I'm ordained by 2 bodies in Canada and the United States. I'm ordained. But who really is ordained? I've seen people who, with massive education, that are not ordained of God at all. They're educated. They've gone through the courses. They've taken the exams. They've had people lay hands on them. They've been investigated and queried by groups of august groups and bodies of people, but they're not ordained to do anything. They're not called of God. They might be called by their grandmother, but not called of God. But there are people. Who are those people or who are ordained? Well, we need to identify them. And not just ordained to the formal ministry, but people who are ordained to lots of things. There are people who are pastors of children, pastors of young people. Well, we know that. We have, in many churches, we have what we call youth pastors, children's pastors. But there are other people, not just those people who have been trained and specifically called and feel that should be their life's vocation and occupation, but there are people who are ordinary church friends who sat on the same pew with us that God's ordained. We have people who are ordained to do service. And I think if we can find these people who do this and recognize them, identify them, and begin to train them and develop them, and then say, you know what? We're gonna let you do what God's called you to do. We're gonna give you all of the tools you need to do it. I think we would see growth in the church. And I think that's why the New Testament church grew, the Apostolic church grew, is because everyone was called of God, ordained of God. Everyone went about using their influence and the people that God had put before them to share the gospel, to teach others, to pass it on, to equip others. And they weren't just sitting in a pew. They were doing the work that God had laid on their hearts to do. And that's what made the apostles so incredible. They were entrepreneurs. They discovered people. They brought them alongside and they released them. Then we went through another period of history when leaders became priests and sacerdotalists, and they were between men and God, and they offered prayers, and they did all sorts of sacraments and that sort of thing, and they wore the right robes, and they were the elite, and we had a hierarchy and all of that. And then came along the Reformation, and we had a new group arise of leaders, and all of a sudden the pulpiteers became teachers. They became professors. So we had a very heavy influence on intellectual accomplishment. And so the Protestant church in its earliest days were driven by intellectuals, which has not been a bad thing particularly, but it was driven by the pulpit and by those who were educated, and the education came out of that. Lots of theological education and formal training. But it was largely those people who were most intellectually exercised. They were the ones who became pastors. And then later on, in about the 17th century, somewhere late 1700s, we got into a new kind of pastorate, which was not apostolic, but it was the local shepherd. It was the parish priest again. We slipped back into the idea of having these people who were not necessarily sacerdotalists, but they maintained the church. They had a parish, and they had a village church, let's say, and it was their job to take care of the hatching, the matching, the patching, and the dispatching. And then out of that came the next group, which was really about the 1960s. We started in then with the church growth movement, and with the church growth movement came the whole idea of the CEO, the visionary, entrepreneurial, top-down leader. But none of these are apostolic. The apostolic leader is one. The apostolic church is a church which does what the New Testament teaches needs to be done. It is that church or those leaders who say, my job is to bring up others, train them, equip them. My job is to do the right things for the right reasons. My job is to help people to see how important prayer is, how important the power of God is, how important the supernatural is in what we believe, how important it is to disciple and build people up. And it's not just a program. It's not how clever we are, how well we do something, or how well we speak, or how we look. But the real call of God in the apostolic sense is to come under everyone and build them up. So that's I think helpful and hopeful that if we can get back to just reading Acts again, and I think it starts with prayer. If we can get people to see that everything that happened in the first century church came out of a sense of the value of the prayer in the way of making available the supernatural to the reality of kingdom living and life.